Back in 1997, Limp Bizkit would release their debut record, $3 Bill Y'all, and while the album was a huge success, there were some markets that weren't as receptive to the band's music, at least initially. This resulted in the band's label resorting to some tactics to make inroads in these markets. While it seemed legal, it came also with a fury of criticism. That's what we're going to discuss in today's video. Back in the middle of the 20th century, a term known as payola became popular in the United States when it came to light that record companies were paying radio DJs money under the table to play their artists' music without publicly disclosing it. Radio DJ Alan Freed would be one of the biggest DJs in America during this era, and he was also instrumental in getting a lot of black artists played on the radio. With DJs wielding so much power, record label people would soon flood the offices of these on-air personalities, offering them cash, clothing, jewelry, even vacations and songwriting royalties, in addition to electronics and even parties. In return, the labels would get a guaranteed number of spins for their artists. It soon became the industry norm in some markets for DJs to require payment to give attention to certain artists. These bribes would add up, with some DJs making 10 to 20K a year just from being paid under the table. A lot of the time, station owners weren't even aware of such arrangements. It was by the late 50s Congress investigated the payola scandal, since it involved the federally controlled airwaves. Basically, what radio DJs were doing was illegal, since the stations were not announcing the sponsorships on the air. Soon enough, radio stations would be threatened with losing their licenses if they continued to engage in payola. Some radio DJs would also lose their jobs, including Alan Freed. Even though rules were put into place, according to the Star Tribune, other forms of payola soon cropped up in the subsequent years, like in the 80s with independent record promoters giving radio programmers cocaine, money, and prostitutes to play records by Bruce Springsteen, Prince, and Cyndi Lauper. Less obvious versions of payola even cropped up in the 90s, where labels would hold station contests for listeners to meet their top-tier acts in exchange for some plays of their lesser-known artists. Fast forward to 1998, it was widely reported at the time that Limp Bizkit's label, Flip Interscope, engaged in what was described as legal payola, better known as pay-for-play. In early '98, Limp Bizkit's label would reportedly pay $5,000 for 50 spins of the band's new single at the time, Counterfeit, over a span of 5 weeks. It was reported in the Star Tribune that a Portland station, KUFO, was initially hesitant to play the band's music since they didn't think their audience would like it. But money soon changed their thinking. This arrangement was supposedly the first of its kind, called pay-for-play. The payment was made to Portland, Oregon station KUFO 101.1, where the band was struggling to find an audience. Before and after the song was played on the Portland station, an announcement came on stating, "Brought to you by Flip Interscope." However, some critics claim the wording was insufficient, since it wasn't clear by that message that money was being exchanged for airplay. If it violated the federal laws, the FCC could have fined the station upwards of $10,000 for each offense and imprisonment for up to a year or both. However, it didn't seem like the FCC investigated it, and some record labels didn't even want to discuss the matter in the press. What may surprise you is that it wasn't the label's idea, but the station's. KUFO's operations manager would tell the New York Times the idea came out of wanting to be clear with the record labels on what we expect from each other and saying, hey, let's take a risk on breaking this band and sharing the rewards of its success. The first 150 spins of any record is a high risk. You don't have a gauge on the song. We approached Interscope because we liked Limp Bizkit. It was one of their priority bands, and we wanted to get some of the money away from print. In reality, some critics claimed radio created the conditions for pay-to-play to happen. At the 1997 edition of South by Southwest, at a panel called All We Want Is Everything, an editor for Spin magazine would reveal that it's so difficult to break in new bands due to the number of available slots on the conglomerate-owned alternative rock stations. New bands just can't get on the radio because programmers don't want to take a chance on them. Limp Bizkit's manager explained the difference between payola and pay-for-play, telling MTV, "This is honest, payola was about fraud. Payola was about DJs defrauding the owners of their stations and potentially hurting ratings by not making musical decisions. When you have a band like Limp Bizkit who sell out 3,000 seaters, Playing music the kids want to hear, finding a way to get them on a radio station without prostituting them is a huge plus for everybody. By us saying this is brought to you by Interscope, you know the money is going to the station. If stations wanted to make bad decisions, then their ratings go down. And that's what supporters of this tactic claim, that the industry would self-regulate. Meanwhile, some radio stations and even some labels would tell Billboard that they felt uncomfortable with the practice. Critics of it alleged that it was unethical and that unsigned bands or bands on smaller labels may not have deep pockets or the connections to get their music played. Others criticized the practice, claiming that radio stations could extort record labels and artists, but Limp Bizkit's manager would claim that pay-to-play was cheaper for labels and artists than other means of promotion. The group's manager would cite radio-sponsored concerts or festivals, which frequently see bands play for little to no money because they could be at risk for getting dropped from the radio station's playlists. It was reported even at the time that Capitol Records in Nashville was exploring the idea of paying $1 million to radio to play spins of only their artists for a continuous block of time. As for whether Limp Bizkit's pay-for-play ploy was successful, the band's label claimed it was. It turned out after the initial test, the band's manager said the quintet's record was so popular among listeners at KUFO that the station added counterfeit to its regular rotation. Meanwhile, frontman Fred Durst was asked about the practice by Rolling Stone in 1999, to which he responded, "It worked, but it's not that cool of a thing. Some stations won't play your shit and the kids want it, so we had to pay to get them to play it. We were on the cover of the New York Times. It couldn't have been better, even though it was negative. At first I was like, what the did I do? But the name Limp Bizkit got on MTV, it got in the paper. Even after the paid radio time expired, we stayed at #1. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the whole practice.